6 years ago, I flew over the Atlantic to South Africa for my first ever safari. I've always had a fascination with Africa and the wildlife of the Serengeti, one that actually stems from being obsessed with The Lion King when I was a kid. I had that Elton John soundtrack on cassette too. I used to annoy my mom so much by belting out Circle of Life every time we drove anywhere. Over time though, that simple love for Simba and his friends evolved and matured, and soon I was researching books on Maasai culture. It got to the point where I was fixated on the idea of traveling to Africa. While my sorority sisters talked about visiting the beaches of Bali or the Bahamas after they graduated, my heart was dead set on the Serengeti. It took me a few years to be able to afford the flights, accommodation, and in-country transportation, but eventually I had a good enough job and I had enough in my bank account to be able to afford my dream trip. It was every bit as amazing as I'd imagined it would be. I spent a whole week on various jeep safaris, hanging out of a 4x4 with a pair of binoculars, and let me tell you, even at a distance, just knowing you're looking at an actual lion is a serious adrenaline rush. On one of those safaris, a nice Canadian guy mentioned how incredible an experience it was, but lamented that he couldn't get just a little bit closer to some of the wildlife. Our guide reminded us that even at 200 meters away, some of the wildlife we were admiring could close the distance in a matter of seconds. It was every bit as humbling as I expected. I've never felt quite so vulnerable in all my life, even in the relatively safe confines of the various jeeps I was traveling in. That feeling was nothing, though, compared to what I felt when I decided to take a very different kind of safari. I first started properly considering an air safari after I landed in Johannesburg and began to see various commercials for them. I'd never really been interested until I spoke to someone on one of my jeep safaris that talked about air tours like they were God's gift to naturalists. According to her, air safaris were by far the best way to observe the wildlife. She'd choose that every time if she could only afford it. Apparently, the animals don't react in quite the same way to the buzzing of an overhead aircraft as they do to a loud, clearly visible jeep. She also mentioned that the best way to get unfettered views of the animals acting completely naturally was to do an air safari. That settled it for me. It didn't matter if it'd take a chunk out of my budget. I needed to get on that air safari to experience the exact same thing these people had. I ended up exchanging emails with a representative from one particular company. They promised me a very extensive tour at a very reasonable price. A few $1,000s later, I was meeting up with a bush pilot on this little airstrip right in the middle of nowhere. I was staring at the single-engine propeller plane we'd be flying around the Serengeti. The beat-up old thing looked like it'd be at least 20 or 30 years old. The pilot assured me, though, that she was the most reliable aircraft in their inventory, and she'd never failed him yet. I was a little bit apprehensive, but since he seemed so confident in the plane's abilities, I saw no reason to disbelieve him. After all, if he didn't think it was safe, surely he'd be the first person to refuse to fly, right? So, with that in mind, I climbed into the passenger side of the prop plane, and off we went into the skies. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. The plane flew low and slow enough for us to get some frankly incredible views of the wildlife. I was actually amazed they didn't react more to some big metal bird flying over their heads. Only the younger animals in each herd seemed to pay any attention to us. All the while, the moms continued to graze like, "Chill, we see these things all the time." Sometimes we'd fly up just a little higher, then lean into a gentle turn that allowed us to circle any herd I took an interest in, giving me a full bird's eye view. I'll admit, it was a little less personal than the jeep safaris. Didn't quite have the same adrenaline hit. But little did I know, I was about to get a lifetime's worth of adrenaline in just a few minutes. After 20 minutes into the flight, we were circling over a herd of elephants, with the steady drone of the plane's engine buzzing in our ears. And then suddenly, the buzzing stopped altogether. It didn't just stop dead either. There was a stuttering, rattling sound as the engine tried to keep itself going for a moment, and then just gave out altogether. I looked over at the pilot, completely baffled, but he waved away my concerns while thumbing the plane's ignition, making out like it happened all the time and this was nothing to worry about. I've stalled my car in traffic before, so I figured what we were going through was the aviation equivalent of just that or something. Irritating at best, scary at worst, but still nothing to actually worry about. Yet as I was waiting for the plane's engine to whir back into life from the pilot's repeated attempts to restart it, it started to dawn on me that this wasn't some run-of-the-mill mechanical problem. The engine had completely died and was not coming back to life. That horrifying fact became obvious once the pilot stopped trying to restart the engine. I don't even know how I managed to avoid a complete mental breakdown. The pilot turned to me and said, "We're gonna have to land. We're going to crash." I remember wanting to ask him if we were going to die, but the words wouldn't leave my mouth. I stayed quiet as the pilot walked me through what we would need to do. "It's gonna be fine, don't worry, but this is gonna be a bit of a bumpy landing, okay?" I couldn't say it at the time, but I was convinced this would be the end. When I realized that, a weird feeling of calm came over me. It was like there was no point worrying about something I was doomed to face. We were going down, and there was nothing I could do about it other than brace for impact. The only thing I could think as we began to drop altitude was hoping the end would be quick and we wouldn't have to burn to death before vultures devoured us or something. At 200 feet, I was concentrating on my breathing, trying to keep calm as the trees and foliage grew bigger and bigger at a fast rate. At 100 feet, I began shaking, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. It was less nervous shaking and more terrified full-body vibration. I turned to the pilot to say something, and I remember him just saying, "Shut up and let me think, woman!" It was the kind of comment that would have me clapping back in a normal situation, but in this dead engine prop plane, I decided to just take it at the chin. At 50 feet, the pilot screamed to hold on. The plane's nose tilted down slightly, and he began to bring us in for the emergency landing. I just remember gripping onto this little handle so tightly. I couldn't bear to watch, so I shut my eyes and hoped for the best. Wham! We hit the dirt hard, but instead of rolling over and crashing, I could feel the landing gear of the plane rumbling against the earth. The plane was shaking like a leaf, and I was convinced it was about to shatter apart. I could hear the pilot shouting, come on, you can do it!" as he talked to the plane. Then, out of nowhere, he started whooping and hollering in celebration. It didn't feel like we were safe, but evidently we were no longer going to explode into a ball of flame or something. When we finally came to a shaky stop, the pilot started laughing maniacally, kissing the dash of the plane. "I told you she hadn't let me down yet." I was in complete shock. I was still shaking, but I turned to the pilot, high-fiving him and telling him he was the man. It was the most intense feeling of my entire life, and one I'll never forget. We were pretty banged up. I had some bruises, but we were otherwise okay. We weren't quite out of trouble yet, though. Once the euphoria died down, we realized we were stranded in the middle of the Serengeti, and our crash had attracted an awful lot of attention. Most animals would have run a mile to get away from the big metal bird that came falling out of the sky, but not all of them. Some of them were attracted to the chaos and destruction, and it led to my closest encounter with any animal in all of Africa. We were quite easily able to relay our coordinates to the rescue team, and the pilot had a few flares he could use to throw on the ground if it got dark. It wasn't like we were going to be stuck there for eternity, but even the 90 minutes we had to wait seemed like forever. We were totally exposed to all of the wildlife surrounding us. We were totally exposed to all the wildlife surrounding us. We got kind of lucky in the end, I think, but we still had a rather close encounter that scared the life out of me. When you think of the scariest animals in Africa, what do you think? Lions, hippos, snakes, spiders? I doubt many people's first answer would be hyenas, but you can bet your butt that was my answer after a pack of them wandered within just 50 feet and started to surround us. People say they laugh, right? The sound that they make is kind of like a person laughing. Let me tell you, once you hear that sound with your own ears, it sounds nothing like laughter. I remember jumping back in the cockpit of the crashed plane. The pilot was taking a nap, but woke up to show me the pistol we kept in the same place as the flares. "If they come any closer, give them a fright, alright?" I tried to relax, but it was hard with a gang of baying hyenas a few feet away. If there ever was a clear sign that bush pilot was completely insane, it was this. I still owed him my life though, so I didn't say squat to him. Not long after, I heard the distinct sound of an engine in the distance, and the plane's radio buzzed to life. The rescue team, having driven as fast as they could for 100 miles to reach us. I'd never been so happy to see another human being in my whole life. They drove us back to civilization, and I ate the best meal I've ever had, with the pilot at a little roadside diner. He asked for 2 orders of bunny chow, which turned out to be an entire loaf of bread stuffed with curry. As it turned out, that and several beers are exactly what a person needs after surviving a plane crash in the middle of Africa. Back in 2004, my wife and I decided we couldn't face freezing our bits off for yet another British winter and started looking for a much more tropical location to spend that festive period. We were working on a bit of a budget and couldn't quite afford the Thai or Vietnamese beaches we'd had our hearts set on, but after a bit of searching, we came across this lovely little beachside bed and breakfast in a little town called Galle, on the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka. It was definitely priced as a budget hotel, but the photos the owners had taken showed it to be a quaint, clean, and beautiful little place. Once my wife was taken with it, I had very little choice on the matter anyway, so I made us a booking. The food was amazing, the people were welcoming, and the beaches were everything we could have hoped for. Come Christmas Day, we had the most unusual Christmas dinner of our lives, sharing a veritable banquet of different dals and curries at a local restaurant. It was so good that neither of us missed the pigs and blankets that year. I'm sure most of you will agree that's really saying something. We finished off with a few drinks on the beach, stopping every so often to giggle at how surreal it all was that we were here sunbathing on Christmas Day. Then, once we were drowsy enough, we headed off to bed for an early night. The next morning was even better. No hangovers, no dodgy leftovers to work through, no going down to the local park in the freezing cold to pretend that a brisk Boxing Day walk is anything but absolute balls. Just sun, sea, and sandy beaches for 5 more days. Me and the wife replaced the horrid Boxing Day park walk with drinks and nibbles in a beachside cafe. Nibbling on dips and wondering how we were going to readjust to life back in the UK again. I mean, it had been literally paradise for almost a full fortnight. We could have never probably guessed in that moment that our festive little Asian trip would turn out to be the biggest mistake of our lives. We soon learned that any dream day can turn into a living nightmare in a matter of minutes. So we're just sitting there in this open-air restaurant, holding hands, enjoying the lovely rhythmic sound of the waves gently breaking against the beach. When suddenly, it stopped. We heard a big rush of water as the water was pulled back away from the shore, but no crash followed. Me and my wife watched as the water crept further and further back away from the shore. And I don't mean like a few feet or something. It kept going and going until we could barely even see the edge anymore. There was only wet sand as far as the eye could see. I distinctly remember the moment I saw these tiny specks on the wet sand in the distance and how it almost looked like they were jumping up and down. And then I realized that's exactly what they were doing. These were fish that had been swimming in the shallows when the water had just disappeared. Now they were flapping around in the sand and gasping for breath. I turned to see the young waitress standing behind us. I asked her what was happening, but her face told me all I needed to know. She was gawking even harder than we were and had obviously never seen anything like this in her life. Next thing I know, there were people sprinting out onto the wet sand with plastic bags, scooping up the fish into them before moving on to the next poor flounder or whatever. It was actually quite amusing for a moment, thinking it must have been the easiest morning's fishing any of them had ever experienced. But in the next moment, I heard this absolute roar of a shout coming from down on the beach. An older man was screaming something to the lads out scooping up fish. He turned and started shouting with his hands cupped around his mouth, like he was trying to announce something serious to everyone. I turned to the waitress to ask her what he was saying, but by that time her dad had showed up and had this horrified look on his face. I could tell he was looking out to the sea, so I turned to see just what it was he was looking at. That's when I saw the water was starting to come back, only it wasn't returning as gently as it had gone away. It was getting faster and faster, the wave getting bigger and bigger. "Sir, ma'am, come upstairs right now," I remember the owner saying very suddenly. "There's a big wave coming. We have to get upstairs now." The cafe was basically a big hollowed-out concrete block, so I was confident we would indeed be safe if we went upstairs where there was another open-air dining area. The only trouble was getting everyone up there. The owner's elderly mother was confined to a wheelchair. I didn't actually see her at first. She was in another room when we all started to move. I was halfway up the stairs already by the time I saw the owner desperately trying to pull her up from the bottom. It was one of the most horrifying moments of my life. I could see the man trying to pull her up the stairs backwards in the wheelchair, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to do it on his own. I basically pushed my wife up the stairs, then forced my way back down towards where the owner was struggling. I grabbed one handle and he grabbed the other, but that wasn't working either. We actually tried to carry the whole thing by grabbing the wheel spokes, but that still wasn't working. The whole time I could hear the wave getting closer and closer. I could hear my wife from the top floor screaming, "Oh my God," as it was getting nearer to the building. Then it struck. We didn't have the owner's mom up as high as we needed. All this water and debris came crashing over us. It was pure chaos for a second. I grabbed onto the banister. All of a sudden, the water level dropped a bit, but it was still rushing past us. This let me see that I'd gotten a hold of the owner's arm while he had a hold of his mom's hands. The wheelchair had been swept away. It was there one moment and gone the next. Dragged away by what turned out to be a 15-foot-high tsunami. I'm sorry if this writing takes a turn at this point. Remembering it is really painful, and I'm sure you'll understand why in a moment. I was pulling up with all my might, trying to keep the owner and by proxy his mom from being washed away. They were too heavy for me to drag out of the water, and I was struggling to hold on myself. I was terrified I was going to lose my grip, which would mean not only would I die, but they would die too. I can't even express how ashamed I am to say this, but there was a moment I thought about just letting go. The kind of terror I felt in that moment, I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. It was like something else just took over, a screw everyone but me kind of attitude that placed my life above all else. But even in that moment, I knew I couldn't let go. If I lost grip on them, if they got ripped away from me, that was different. But for me to let go seemed like murder for me to go through with it. The next thing I knew, I was snapped out of that horrible moment by screaming from the owner and his mom. I didn't have a clue what they were saying. I'm choking up as I'm writing this. The owner suddenly let go of his mom's hand. I thought she might have slipped or something, but the way he turned so purposefully and ran back up the stairs, I knew he'd just let her go. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do, so I followed him up the stairs to the safety of the top floor. I felt my wife hug me before she burst into tears. It hadn't occurred to me, but because she hadn't been able to see what I was doing, she thought I'd been washed away the whole time. She was crying and screaming at me. I swear I wanted to tell her what just happened, but I just couldn't. Instead, I looked over the edge of the open-top dining area and gasped at the utter destruction below us. The entire landscape had been transformed, almost unrecognizable. The water kept going and going inland, never slowing down and never stopping. I remember the moment I realized it could have been happening to the entire island. Miles and miles of coastline, completely and utterly destroyed in a few moments. Yet although it was bad enough when the water was coming in, it was even worse when the tide dragged it back out again. All that death and destruction that was caused bulldozing its way inland was pulled back past us as the wave returned to the ocean. I saw so many bodies I lost count. Every other second I saw a patch of pink or brown floating on the surface, a streak of color from someone's clothing. So many dead people, so many who didn't see it coming. But the hardest part for me to bear was yet to come. When the majority of the danger had passed by, there was just stagnant water on the floor below us. the owner and one of his sons ventured downstairs to bring up what little food and water they could salvage from the kitchen. We knew the rescue wouldn't be quick, and the people were already working their way through the mess outside, pulling out dead bodies and survivors alike. Me and my wife pitched in as best as we could, but the fact remained there just wasn't much we could do other than try to comfort the handful of people with us. That night, none of us could sleep, even with the free beer that the owner had given us. So when I saw him smoking a cigarette in the darkness all on his own, I thought I should give him a bit of company. I hadn't smoked since I first tried in college, but that night I asked him for a cigarette. Out of nowhere, he said to me, "I didn't want to let her go." I didn't even really know what to say. I knew he was referring to his mom, but I didn't know if he was just trying to rationalize or what, so I nodded. He went on to tell me that his mom had told him to let her go. She knew I wasn't strong enough to pull them both in, and she also knew it wouldn't be long before we'd all be dragged off. So she sacrificed herself for us. The owner told me their little exchange went something like this: "Let me go." "No, you'll drown. If you don't let me go, we'll all die." "Son, I've had a long life, and I've had a good life. You've been a good son, and you've made me very proud. But your family, you need to take care of them, so do as I tell you." He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye, so he just let her go, then turned and went to look after his family, just like his mom had told him to. This all happened 16 years ago, and I still can't talk or think about it without tearing up every time. I can't even imagine being in that position. Just knowing it happened was completely traumatizing. Only God knows how the man dealt with it himself. I think that's why this has been so helpful to type up. I can't really talk to anyone about what happened that day, besides my wife anyway. They either get frustrated or they don't understand. If they ask too many questions, I start thinking about the owner's mom again. I choke up and then there's no more talking at all. I think to an extent, the trauma just kind of becomes part of you. It doesn't hurt anyone, it's not debilitating, but it's always there, like the scar left behind after a deep wound. When I was about 16, I needed to get a job. I was out of high school and living with my parents who were driving me insane. I needed to get out. I was applying for jobs everywhere I could find. I would walk into a store and immediately ask if they were hiring. I didn't really care where I worked. I just needed the money to get out of my current living situation. The local grocery store was having a mass hire job fair type deal on a specific day and time. I woke up early, got ready, and went. Everyone looking to get a job had to stand in a line and wait to be interviewed. No big deal. I just fumbled with my phone while I waited. The guy in front of me was standing sideways, so he could easily face me and anyone behind me. He continually asked me questions like, "Is this your first job? How old are you? How far would you have to drive to get to work here?" After the last one, I sarcastically told him I didn't know he was the person that was supposed to interview me. I thought he got the point because he stopped talking to me soon after. We got further up in line, and finally he was being interviewed in the little office. It was really just a set of tall pieces of cardboard that gave the illusion of privacy during your interview. It was set up right in front of the grocery store too, so anyone walking outside could see you during it. I was getting nervous because I really wanted the job. When he got done and came out, he said, "Hope you get the job, cutie. I'd love to see more of you." He walked past me. If it weren't for the interview coming up, I probably would have told him to get lost. Anyway, I get into the makeshift cubicle or whatever. The guy hands me some papers and tells me to fill them out. I do so and hand them back to him when I get done. When I lifted my head up, I saw behind the man interviewing me was that same creep from before, standing a little bit away trying to hide and watching me during my interview. I had already been reasonably anxious before, but now I was starting to really worry. I tried my best to make it through without looking at him and answer the questions I was being asked. Occasional glances toward that man, though, rewarded me with witnessing the creep groping the glass, having his hand down his pants, and jerking off. Finally, he began to take pictures of me with his phone. I was ready to call the cops as soon as I got out of there, if he was still around. When my interview was wrapping up, I was given some pamphlets and a gift card for a few bucks off groceries. I shook hands with the interviewer, and when I looked back at the window, the man was no longer there. Relief washed over me. I went to leave and hoped to God I didn't just fuck up my interview because of that distraction. I walked through the grocery store back to the door I'd entered in, and shortly after walking outside, I saw the man leaning up against the wall, waiting for me. I pulled my keys out and put them in between my knuckles like I was taught to do at a young age. My other hand went straight to my pocket, grabbing hold of my phone. I started to walk towards my car. As I walked past him, he stepped to walk beside me. "So, how'd it go?" "You're really too cute to be working at a grocery store, you know. You'd make a lot more money without even having to leave your house if you just went online." It was disgusting, but I said nothing. "Oh, so you're gonna be like that, huh? Not gonna say anything to me? Probably a good idea, because if you open that mouth of yours, I'd be tempted to stick my..." I cut him off by swinging around towards him and punching him in the throat with my key fist. Unfortunately, my grip on my keys weren't tight enough, and they fell out of my hand on impact. That was enough to shut him up though and get him choking. I grabbed my keys off the ground and sprinted for my car. He was following after me, calling me a fucking bitch and other vulgarities I can't remember. I jumped into my car and locked it just in time as he began to slam his fists on my driver's side window. I was shaking like crazy. I pulled out my phone, and after a few feeble attempts from my shaking hands, I correctly dialed 911. He was pounding on my window, shouting about how I assaulted him, trying to open my doors, walking around to see if any of the doors were unlocked. I tried my best to talk to the dispatcher and tell them where I was at. When he got back to my driver's side door and continued to pound on it and cuss at me, I held my phone up to the window. He could see I'd dialed 911. On that note, his face went white, and he looked around and casually walked away. I waited a bit before telling the dispatcher I thought he was gone. They didn't want to send out a patrol if he'd already left. The dispatcher got the description of the man from me and told me they'd have someone come out and look at the grocery store's camera footage. They would talk to the guy who interviewed me as well to see if they could find out who the guy was. I never heard from the man again. And thankfully, to my knowledge, as I frequent this store quite regularly, the man did not get the job. Unfortunately, neither did I. Warning: upsetting content ahead. Where to start with this story? So I work as a veterinary nurse assistant. We get unusual things brought into our clinic, but this one I just had to share. Today, the 31st of October 2020, was my Saturday to work. I was on reception with the receptionist and vet nurse. Early 9 a.m., we get a call from an elderly man. Says he found a dead cat in his front garden at the time. Looked like its head had been caved in or something. We often get deceased animals brought in as a result of being hit by a car, so we asked him to bring it down to us. Before 10 a.m.-ish, the elderly man came in with a black cat in a plastic bag. We took contact details from the man. Then he told us about how he'd found it and how upset his wife was. Here's where things got creepy though. The cat was in a clear plastic bag. It had no head. It was decapitated. On further inspection, where the cat's head should have been were clean cuts as well. Now, a bit of a background. I live in the UK, and a while back we had a string of mutilated animals being found outside homes and in parks. At that point, the supposed suspect was called the Croydon Cat Killer, or the M25 Cat Killer. The police ruled it out to be foxes, supposedly. I've seen plenty of animals, though, that have been attacked by other animals, and I can say with absolute confidence this was no animal. The whole body, apart from the missing head, was intact. No bites, puncture wounds, broken bones, nothing to suggest the cat had been killed by an animal. It was as if it had been cut clean by a knife. We scanned the poor cat for a microchip and found one. We looked up the details on the microchip system and found the cat's name as well, Lucifer. A black cat named Lucifer found beheaded on Halloween. I wish that wasn't true and I just made it up, but sadly it was not. We tried contacting his owners. Home phone wasn't connecting, so we left a message on the mobile phone number that we'd found Lucifer and to call ASAP. Another disturbing thing was the address where Lucifer was found was 2 streets over from his registered address, and very close by my vet clinic as well. I was very wary when I finished my shift, and waited outside the clinic until my husband was outside to pick me up. It was an unnerving feeling, realizing that whoever did this was still lurking around out there. We alerted the police, RSPCA, and a group called Snarl as well, South Norwood Animal Rescue and Liberty. The lovely old man agreed to be contacted by the police and to help in any way. I've worked alongside animal cruelty and abuse cases, but this was the most chilling, disturbing, and upsetting thing I'd ever encountered. I'm hoping we get good news about this story and find out just who was behind this.